feature presentation.
Live from Toronto, it's Saturday night!
I was going to do that.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another Untitled TIFF review. I am your host, Matt Rohrbeck. Alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he's tomato meter approved, Eric Marchin.
So we're clearly talking about The Apprentice on this episode.
Yes. Today we are reviewing right out of its it hasn't even had its premiere at TIFF yet. We saw a press screening. Jason Reitman's
last minute press screening,
yeah.
by the way, too, in IMAX, but not real IMAX.
As it warns us before each screening in Scotiabank 12, which is the IMAX cinema. We might sound better than we normally do during TIFF, although I'm still getting over this cold or whatever the hell that I have, so I apologize if I cough.
So you sound like shit.
Yeah. It's day 3 of the 2024 Toronto International Film Festival. Eric and I have a night where a Saturday night, live in our homes. Eric's Airbnb and I'm back at my condo. So we decided, you know what, instead of on the street, we're going to do it old school, normal way at home with microphones because it's pretty chilly out tonight, Eric. So
it is. It's a cool one. Fall is in the air, Matt.
Yes.
Fall is in the air.
How are you doing at the end of day 3?
I'm alive. I felt a little bit tired watching Saturday night, even though it's always an interesting experience when you watch a movie that's not formatted for IMAX or enhanced for IMAX in an IMAX theater. There's a novelty, I think, to watching something like this on, one of the biggest screens in Toronto and the biggest format possible. So it's kind of almost like an added incentive to see a screening like this. And it did pop up so last minute that I think it made the screening kind of more enjoyable in the sense that it wasn't packed to the gills and it didn't feel overly clustered, but maybe that would have added something to it, because as we get into this review, I think one of the biggest problems with this movie, which is basically a real-time comedy thriller set hours before 90 minutes, I think specifically before the launch of the first episode of Saturday Night in October of 1975 at 11:30. And that was obviously the beginning of a long withstanding skit series that redefined the late night format on weekends, because before then you had reruns of Johnny Carson, which I thought was kind of interesting just in terms of thinking that, a late night talk show usually is Monday to Friday, and then, playing reruns of them on the weekend, which now in, this day and age, SNL does that as well, where there are episodes of SNL when they're on their hiatus or off season, they'll play older episodes, sometimes going back to the 70s. But I think before we even get into the review, it's interesting. What is your era of SNL?
I have a couple different ones. So SNL has a special place in my heart, which I think is why I was excited for this. And I've liked Jason Reitman's work for the most part. I absolutely adore Up in the Air and Thank You for Smoking. I enjoy Juno and, some of his earlier stuff. Maybe not so much. Whoop, whoop, whoop. They're here to arrest you. For your brat summer, all your opinions this year. The bad boys of cinema, they're finally coming for us, man. So I remember my Uncle Mark, who actually is a big reason why I, love, movies and things like that. Like he was the guy who was the pop culture guy, introduced me to video games, introduced me to Star Wars and all this kind of stuff that, my dad's a very outdoorsy kind of guy. I love my dad. We connect with hockey and lots of different things, but my dad was never the pop culture kind of guy. My dad, weirdly enough, loves SNL now, but
he also likes George Carlin. Like he's a big George Carlin guy.
Yeah, absolutely. So getting back to it, my Uncle Mark would babysit me and I would go over on weekends and stay over at my Uncle Mark and Aunt Dana's house. And one of the things I remember is when I was younger, he would let me stay up late to watch SNL on Saturday nights when he would watch me, and we would always order a Domino's pizza. He'd be like, you want to order a pie and watch SNL? And it was just like this kind of thing I would do with my Uncle Mark, and it's always stuck with me. And, I think that era with, Will Ferrell and, later on with Kristen Wiig and that, Maya Rudolph and everyone who came out from that, that's two different eras kind of blending in with each other. But then I think from the Will Ferrell era on, I watched it up until maybe The Lonely Island left SNL. And I
what
think
you say?
Yeah, if you haven't been listening to the Seth Meyers and Lonely Island podcast, it is excellent if you're an SNL fan and a Lonely Island fan, because it covers both their digital shorts, but then also with Seth Meyers being involved in being a head writer on SNL for so long, and doing Weekend Update and things like that, and being part of a bunch of different eras of SNL that kind of goes into both the sketches and the digital shorts. And, he always jokes about on that podcast being like, they'll talk about certain things. And he's like, I always think of it as N golden era. And they talk about all these different golden eras of SNL because everyone has that golden era of SNL that they have.
And what that really means is nostalgia.
Yeah, totally. And I think, but then I don't think that there's anything wrong with that, because at those times we were talking off air, and you can get into your thoughts on SNL. But, when I was younger and in my teen years and into my 20s, I really did enjoy SNL. I love the format of bringing in a celebrity guest every week and then being able to have fun. Sometimes you would get dramatic actors, sometimes you would get comedians, and everyone just going in and having fun. And then the people which we'll get into, coming out of SNL, it was really this kind of, lack of a better term, like breeding ground for like really great comedians that would then go on to do really funny movies afterwards, or great writers and things like that would come out of SNL. I don't know if there's like certain sketches there are that stand out in my head, especially with Will Ferrell and a lot of the Lonely Island digital shorts and the albums that came out of that. But yeah, there was a good chunk of my life where I was like watching SNL every Saturday. And then, if for being on for 50 years, it's just like The Simpsons kind of to me, where you have that era of The Simpsons that you watched and it's still there. And sometimes you might throw it on because you're like, it's a Saturday night, or there's a host on there that you're like, oh, I'm curious to see how they would like do this, or a musical guest you might be interested in.
Like Steven Seagal.
Or yeah, sure. You'll get into that too. Or like Weekend Update, my dad really loves. So even when we go to visit him, he'll show us like things that he really enjoyed. Like my mom and dad watch SNL to this day every Saturday, and my dad, or he'll tape it and or PVR it or whatever and watch it on Sunday mornings in the morning or something like that. But anyways, that's long-winded. But that's why I was kind of excited for this. The Aykroyd, Belushi, this Chevy Chase early days of SNL, I'm not like, I know all those guys that came from there, but I know them from their movies they did after SNL or things like that. Like I wouldn't say I watched SNL in this era at the very beginning. At all. I mean, this movie.
Well, you weren't even alive in 1975.
Well, no, but I mean, some people would go back and watch stuff, right? But yeah. This movie, mixed feelings aside, has made me want to at least, excuse me, sorry everyone, go back and watch that first episode now that we've kind of seen this dramatic retelling of the, chaos that went into it. And I'll save my thoughts for after your history of SNL, but I think that's why I was looking forward to this. And with Jason Reitman, after doing Ghostbusters, going back to, that dramedy thing that he's good at, even though this is sort of different than what he's done sort of in the past. But
he also wrote the script with Gil Kenan, who wrote Ghostbusters and actually directed Frozen Empire.
Yeah. That's maybe telling. But anyways, what's your history with SNL?
My history is similar in the sense of, because we're basically a year
same age, basically.
Basically, yeah. I'm a little bit more senior than
you're
you.
Closer, a little bit closer to death than I am.
Yes, and I embrace that beautiful end. I feel like I'm going to go into a Werner Herzog monologue or voiceover narration. I'm similar in the sense of, you just touched on it, where like I think even the people in the 90s, people like Phil Hartman, you mentioned The Simpsons, or like the overlap, and talking about like someone like Conan O'Brien. And seeing that like you had a lot of writers or performers who were also writers, or started out as writers and then became performers. But I was more familiar with the films. I think I watched Ghostbusters, hundreds of times before ever, watching any of the old episodes of SNL, because they would release compilation DVDs of the older shows, and then also right? Specific, like you'd have the Adam Sandler DVD collection of all his kind of greatest hits, or Chris Rock, or people like that. And so you kind of go back, and then there's some people you didn't even realize, like when you were a kid and you're watching certain movies, or certain actors or comedians based on their films. Like I didn't realize as a child that like someone like Billy Crystal was an SNL alumni, in the sense of I knew him as the guy from When Harry Met Sally, and hosting the Oscars first. But then you go back in like the 80s, the early 80s into like the end is usually kind of like the gray zone, or the one era that a lot of people do not like, when it comes to with the exception of Eddie Murphy, who was kind of like the superstar at that point. And even with the beginning of SNL, it's interesting because that core cast that comes in, Chevy Chase was kind of like, front and center for a lot of it. John Belushi is as well. And you can tell, obviously, John Belushi inspired people, like Chris Farley later on, and had a very similar self-destructive streak in him. But, there was that feeling of like, because like for me, I was always like a Bill Murray guy in terms of the movies I liked. And when I was watching something like Stripes or Ghostbusters, I was more into that than, National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, or like I liked Caddyshack as a kid. It's not dated very well, but that was also interesting because there was contention between the two, because that was around the time that Chevy Chase had left and Bill Murray was on SNL and had a predominantly better career, and was considered to be funnier than Chase, because for the most part, like the thing I always associated with Chevy Chase on SNL was him playing Gerald Ford and falling down. Like that was kind of like his big funny thing. And he did Weekend Update, but I think like for me, probably the best version of Weekend Update was someone like Norm Macdonald, who kind of was like perfect,
Norm's great. Yeah.
Like TV public access kind of reporter. And like, again, like if you go and watch or listen to Conan's podcast, he has Jim Downey on it. And Jim Downey was one of Norm's kind of head writers when it came to the Weekend Update stuff. And there was even some interesting, Jim Downey got fired because the executive or the head at the time was friends with OJ Simpson. And there was this whole contention there as well when it came to how, they were tackling the trial. But yeah, I would say like for me, like Adam Sandler, I think for both of us as well, was obviously bigger in terms of the movies, but we also, recognize like the Hanukkah song and things like that. So yeah, I would say for me though, like I like SNL to a certain degree, but I never found the show completely hysterical, or
it's so hit or miss,
funny.
Right?
Like there are tons of funny people that have gone on to have great careers afterwards, and that were funny working on the show. But I think because SNL is such, and especially now, like I don't really watch it now, but I do know like some of the people that are on it. It feels like it is a good launching pad for careers than it is anything else. In the same way, like I don't think,
but that should be saying something though. About,
definitely.
Show,
but I think it's almost saying something more about how talented some of these people are, outside of doing these seasons, and however long that they stay where they can be funny. Like I think like the Californians is a funny bit, there's always an exception to the rule, but you look at, the films that like someone like Will Ferrell makes, after the fact, and they're I think, funnier than most of the skits that he was involved in, unless he was a lead.
Sure.
And so you do wonder, it's like, oh, like, why has this show gone on as long as it has? And, what am I taking for granted here in terms of, the origin story of SNL and, the behind the scenes bedlam of, Lorne Michaels trying to keep everything together while, the old guard and gatekeepers of, TV's past
Of the peacock.
are trying to sabotage him or make him fail in a way that they can continue on with just the safe reruns of Johnny Carson or the Rompus Room, and so there's this interesting dichotomy between the old and new generation, and the younger generation being people in their 20s trying to put together this major undertaking and production and doing it live, and the skits and bringing it all in, and all of that should be
sketches. Okay, sketches.
Yes. Robert Wool is in this movie, and I think a lot of people will probably remember him best as Knox, the reporter from Batman -- he's in the control room. You know him as soon as you see him. But part of watching this movie, I think why it fails is because the anxiety that it's trying to induce never engrosses you in the way that it, a real-time thriller should work. We know what the outcome is going to be.
50 years of success.
50 years of success. But when it comes to making a movie, I think films that are successful, the ones even that are rooted in history, make you doubt or think about, oh, maybe there is a possibility that this could fail. Like even something like a good war movie, like you look at Dunkirk, right? There's the suspense.
The outcome, but the journey
in the
should
moment,
be thrilling. Yeah,
you feel as though anything could happen, and I think Reitman fails on that in the way that he's almost trying to emulate Aaron Sorkin's style of writing, of that rat-a-tat sort of walking and talking and trying to maneuver things, which is also very funny to think of because Aaron Sorkin wrote the failed series Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip.
I liked that show, actually. From what I remember of the half a season it aired or whatever. But yeah, I'm kind of with you. Like, I don't think I hate the movie or anything. I just think I was a little disappointed in it. I think that, that you hear all these stories about SNL, how, even to this day, I think it is especially listening to the Seth Meyers and Lonely Island podcast, they would talk about how sometimes they wouldn't get scripts done for those, digital shorts until Friday night, and they would shoot Saturday morning, and then they would edit Saturday afternoon, and then they would lock like right before it aired. And that's just the pre-tape stuff. And then you hear Seth Meyers talk about how things would come down to the wire, or if the show's running long, you'd have to rewrite your sketch in the middle of the show and submit it, and like changes come down to the wire. So excuse me, sorry everyone. You always heard about this controlled chaos of how, it would always come down to the last minute, or you wouldn't know what the show was, or everything seems like it would fail up until the last minute. But I think we're missing that controlled here. And I understand that this is the first ever episode of Saturday Night Live, or in that moment, it's called Saturday Night. And I just, having Gabriel LaBelle play Lorne Michaels, and all the stories you've heard about Lorne of being very dry and kind of blunt and things like that. And I know he's a younger man in this, and he's trying to get this show on air. But I wanted some of that controlled chaos, where I think the movie shows you the chaos, but not to a point where, to your well-spoken point, Eric, where you never feel that tension, like it's not going to work out for them. Like you go, how is this all going to come together? But then by the end of it, it just comes together, and you don't really have a moment of being like, and maybe that's how it is or how it feels on the show. But if you have someone like Lorne Michaels, who is the architect of speaking where I guess architect is the theme of TIFF this year, of this show and this controlled chaos. Like I wanted a little bit more from Lorne Michaels of like, yes, he's not in control of everything, but somehow he sort of is. And he's bumbling around, and yeah, it's got a lot of fast talking and cross talk and shaky cam. You brought up the Safdie brothers and different things like that. Like it's trying to be gritty and film grainy, and you sometimes can't even tell what's going on screen or what characters are saying and things like that. And it's these long single takes that are going through the Studio 8H in Rockefeller Center, and if you're familiar with SNL, all of it's kind of fun to see or kind of like interesting to watch, but it just never goes to that next level that you kind of hope it would. Where I just kind of felt very medium or tepid on it. Like there's some laughs there. I think you have some good. What I also liked is like SNL's filled with impersonations or impressions and stuff, right? So I kind of like that they embrace that in this movie, and they are impressions. A lot of these, you have an incredible cast, of great actors and up and coming actors and things like that.
In the way that this cast was up and coming in 1975.
Exactly. So I kind of love all that as well. But you have, I think Dylan O'Brien as Dan Aykroyd was a lot of fun to watch. Like I thought it was a really good impression. I thought Corey Michael Smith as Chevy Chase was a great impression and a great performance. I like seeing people like, Gabriel LaBelle and Cooper Hoffman and in this ensemble and Rachel Sennett and other people as well. You got greats like Willem Dafoe and J.K. Simmons. And like, so it has all the, like the recipe for all of this stuff. And I just feel like it just never quite came together to the point where I'm like, oh, this rocks, or this is cool. Like this is a cool premise. The 90 minutes leading up to SNL, it's almost real time, and this chaos that's happening, and like, how are they going to get this done? And then at the end of it, you're like, oh, it just kind of
worked itself out.
It worked itself out, and you're like, oh, I would have liked some more problem solving here rather than just, it always works out. So, I think that's my main issue, where it just feel like it never kind of kicks into that next gear. And, certain things annoyed me. I didn't like Nicholas Braun playing both Andy Kaufman and Jim Henson.
Well, it's kind of confusing too, because I think what it is it's almost a tribute to Andy Kaufman in terms of like a performance artist thing, where Andy Kaufman was known as a man of many disguises and dressing up and playing different people. And at first I thought Andy Kaufman, as we see him first coming to SNL as the movie begins, was actually pretending to be Jim Henson. But the fact is it's not. He is playing different roles, and that it just doesn't work. I think he is better as Andy Kaufman, just in terms of less is more. Like I think Andy Kaufman can be funny, but also, in small doses. And, after, and that's the thing, like we'll get into this more in Michaels. There was a time when the audience did not want Andy Kaufman to be on the show anymore, and he kind of left Andy Kaufman out to dry in a way that was pretty bad. And then obviously, like he was a staple on the ensemble comedy series Taxi and things. But there's just this feeling of like, and I guess the pun is intended here, but it all feels televised in a way that what's going to happen, what the problems are going to be, that they'll eventually get around to solving them. But at the same time, you want to get lost in it all. You want to get lost in that controlled chaos, as you're saying, where it's like, oh, I think maybe this character, Lorne Michaels, this version of Lorne Michaels is in over his head, or he's, barely keeping his head above water. And I don't even understand completely his motivation for doing this. He continues to talk about being a revolutionary and, being a child of growing up in, the early days of television, as a lot of these, 20 somethings are. But I never understood like what keeps him going to to
Yeah.
do this, and why he likes it, and why he likes these people that are also dysfunctional and self-destructive, and how is he
It's all very
able
surface level,
yeah,
right?
and how is he able to wrangle these people? Like there's this whole
Exactly.
ongoing thing of John Belushi not signing his contract, right up until the show begins, and John Belushi again very self-destructive, doing tons of drugs, and there's this weird thing where they don't even really have Belushi interacting with Dan Aykroyd at all, which I found kind of strange. They
No
kind of
Blues Brothers
I know.
reference.
Well, just because I mean, those guys were joined at the hip, and
Yeah.
you have more of sort of the antagonistic relationship between Belushi and Chevy Chase, and
Yeah.
and also like Belushi was known for being extremely misogynistic to the point where he was watching one episode and finally said that like Jane Curtin was great, and then his wife was like, "Well, yeah, she was always good." It's like you're just figuring that out now,
Sure. Yeah.
and things like that. Where like I didn't get a sense of like any of these. Like nobody's necessarily bad in the roles, even
Yeah.
though I think like Gilda Radner, for example, is miscast. I don't think Ella Hunt is necessarily awful in the movie. It's just it doesn't feel like Gilda Radner. It just feels like somebody doing an SNL impression of Gilda Radner. And that's a shame because she was such a big part of that show in the early years, and a big kind of comedic icon. So, when you have someone like, Dylan O'Brien, who, kind of gets the mannerisms down perfectly of Dan Aykroyd, but doesn't make him feel like a stereotype, especially, coming from someone who's autistic, and Dan Aykroyd is as well. It felt very genuine in the way that like, Aykroyd has all these little tidbits of information that he shares, that whether it's about history or medicine or interesting sort of like side tangents, it felt very much like, okay, this is, what I kind of loved about Ray Stantz as well in Ghostbusters, and he brought all
Yeah.
of that passion to that role, and so you see that there, and like I like the idea of what this movie is. I just don't think the execution works, and then you really start to kind of become removed from the events because you're looking at it just from the artifice of it all, like the cinematography, the production design. It feels a little bit overwrought in its development, or even weirdly proud of itself that it's kind of doing something that seems subversive when in fact you're watching a movie that is just copying, like we're talking about the Safdie brothers, but just the idea of what we've gotten recently with anxiety inducing films.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't even come close to capturing that state of like, you should be on the edge of your seat, unable to breathe or feel like you're taking pauses, and it never gets there. And
Yeah.
the conclusion just is not satisfying in any way whatsoever, when it comes to how things just work themselves out. And that's a part of life, but it would have been nice to have more of Lorne Michaels be the glue, and maybe also be a little bit more critical of Lorne Michaels in terms of there's this conversation about his background between Dan Aykroyd and Rosie Schuster, who's played by Rachel Sennett in the movie, about sort of him kind of being like this lost puppy dog and sort of grafting onto her family. And if you're not familiar with Rosie Schuster, she is the daughter of Frank Schuster, who's part of the Canadian comedy duo of Wayne and Schuster, and also the cousin of Joe Schuster, who is the co-creator of Superman. So she has this really interesting background and legacy of her own. And I never understood their relationship entirely as well, because it's almost hinted at is that Dan Aykroyd is having an affair with her. And it just even having, Lorne Michael as a producer on this film, it almost feels like it is kind of scrubbing clean some of maybe the more interesting and, flawed elements of who Lorne Michaels is, and it is also afraid to become, and which he has become, which is almost this apathetic, figurehead that just sits there in a chair and watches the show drone on and doesn't really do anything anymore other than just,
chooses sketches.
Or has become a caricature in his own way, the way that, that we see like someone like J.K. Simmons, Milton Berle, almost, past his prime.
J.K. Simmons has probably the best line in the movie. I don't want to spoil it.
It's
but,
pretty
like,
vicious.
Yeah, like I was caught off guard with it. It was to tease it. It's one of the best comebacks I've ever heard.
Yeah. And that's the movie it needed to be. It needed to have that set of teeth to just rip into, like, it's too much of a movie that's praising itself. And in order to, like, I think even the people in SNL would look at this and be like, no, you need to be irreverent, and you need to tear this apart, and need to show, like, even though it was successful, it was a shit show. And the people were horrible to each other.
It thinks it's doing that, but I would be curious to hear, the reaction from either people who have worked on SNL later, or, obviously the people that are featured here. Like, how's Chevy Chase feel about his portrayal in this movie? That's
especially
one
where
thing
his career has gone.
Yeah, that's one thing that they do, I guess, get right, is that Chevy Chase is an asshole. So it's the one recurring thing that everyone's in agreement on. It's like, oh, he was always an asshole, and he still is an asshole. So there's that. Not much else to say other than that. Like, a little bit kind of disappointing, but I still think that there's enough there where if you are a big SNL fan, or if you were a big fan of some of the actors featured here, or watched these early days of SNL, or have gone back, and I don't even think you need to be a fan of the early days. Like, if you just were a fan of SNL, I personally still think it's worth a watch. Would I say go rush out and see it in a theater? No. But
I think if you are an SNL fan, like, I think you are going to see it, because there is that curiosity of, you know, how it started. But I almost feel like even that is something that I'm a little bit sick of when it comes to, biographical,
the origin movie,
the prequel, the because sometimes that's not as interesting as, like, say, a shift in casting, like when Chevy Chase left and Bill Murray came in. Like, I think that's a more interesting angle in terms of how the show started as one thing, because they even talk about this in the movie. They don't know what the show is yet, and I feel like when you're beginning something, it's less interesting than when you find your footing. When something kind of starts to work, and then you have to change or adapt based on something being, pulled. It's almost like a game of Jenga, or Jenga, where like you're taking that piece out and hoping that the whole thing doesn't collapse. And I find that that's more interesting than actually building it from the beginning. Or even like the joke that I made earlier. Like, I think a more interesting, probably funnier idea, and maybe it'd be a sequel, is do like the night that Steven Seagal hosted, because it is known, Steven Seagal, for most people that worked at, on that episode at that time, including someone like Bob Odenkirk and Al Franken, have all said that he is truly the worst host that they've ever had. He did not give them anything to work with. He didn't understand comedy. And the last sketch in the episode isn't even a comedy bit. And Seagal brought in his own stuntman to do a fight sequence, and to this day it is a hard episode to find. Like, you can't get it on Peacock and Hulu, and that would be funny, because it's like the night Steven Seagal came home, in that Halloween style kind of thing. And it's like, that's something I recommend people do, is go and listen to those interviews with like Bob Odenkirk. There's like one on Howard Stern where he talks about it for just a couple minutes, and it sounds like the wildest thing you've ever heard. Or Dana Carvey being like, we didn't even know what to do at this point.
See, I wouldn't be against like revisiting this in different, eras, golden eras of SNL, or like those infamous episodes or moments that you've heard about. Like, I'm not even against that, even after being kind of medium on this, because I do think you have 50 years of history. It's
the SNL universe.
Yeah, the SNL cinematic universe, which we've pretty much already gotten with all the spin-off movies and things like that. But yeah, a little mixed negative on my end, and I think sort of negative, mixed negative on your side as well. So, but thank you all for listening. We really do appreciate it. We'll be reviewing probably 2 to 3 films a day during the Toronto International Film Festival. We have reviews out right now for The Brutalist, as well as The Life of Chuck. So you guys can go check those out. We'll have more reviews for tons and tons of other movies. Just keep it locked right here on Untitled Movie Podcast on all podcast services or on YouTube. It is just the audio version, but you can always throw that on your TV or your phone if you don't like using a podcast service. Go check out our letterbox, which is Untitled_movies. We'll be posting all the reviews and things over there. And you can follow both Eric and I at Matt Rohrbeck and at EM6211, where we will be posting our immediate initial reactions to most of the films that we're seeing this week at TIFF. I think that's it for now. It is a Saturday night. I believe Saturday Night Live isn't back yet, right? Like I think it's on hiatus.
No, I think it's until October, and they'll probably do something in coordinating with this. Yeah,
I'm assuming someone from this movie will host the premiere. You got to think, right?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, maybe Rachel Sennett will, because her star's on the rise and things like that.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to think who they would get. Maybe they'll put Gabriel LaBelle, who I do think is a really good actor. I know we didn't talk much about this, but it is funny that he's both now an avatar for Steven Spielberg and Lorne Michaels, but it's almost like the handsome version of these guys.
Them. Yeah, he's good. Nothing against him in this. But it's just the character of Lorne Michaels. Cooper Hoffman also good.
It's Dick Ebersol, who's a
Willem Dafoe is great always.
But even that is an interesting thing where, like, I feel like the motivation for the character and what he ultimately decides in terms of the fate of SNL.
I know it doesn't feel.
It doesn't feel. Yeah. Like I was questioning, like, what was that change of heart really?
Yeah, I agree. All right. Until next time.
Ladies and gentlemen, Untitled Movie Podcast.